They fired the elderly janitor without a thank you. Then the new CEO uncovered a shocking secret. The envelope was taped to the mop closet door with a single strip of brown packing tape. It was not sealed. It was not addressed. It had his employee number printed at the top in small block letters, and below that, 3 paragraphs that changed everything. Walter Briggs read it once. Then he read it again. Then he folded it in half, slid it into the pocket of his work trousers, and stood very still in the east corridor of Callaway Manufacturing for a long moment while the overhead light above him flickered twice and then held. He was 71 years old. He had walked through that same east corridor every morning for 31 years. He knew the way the floor felt under his boots at 5 in the morning, slightly cooler near the loading bay doors, slightly warmer where the old pipes ran beneath the concrete. He knew which ceiling tiles had water stains behind them. He knew that the third sink in the men's room on the second floor ran a few degrees hotter than the others, and that the fire door at the end of the north hallway took an extra half-second to fully close after someone pushed through it. He knew this building the way a man knows his own home. He had kept it clean, kept it safe, kept it running quietly in all the ways that no one ever noticed because that was the nature of the work. When it was done well, it was invisible. When it was done badly, everyone complained. Walter had never given anyone reason to complain. The letter in his pocket told him that his position had been eliminated effective immediately under Restructuring Clause B7. It told him that severance was not applicable under the terms of that clause. It told him to return any company property and collect his personal items from HR. There was no signature, just a printed name he did not recognize, from a department called Organizational Transition Services, which had not existed 6 months ago. He picked up his thermos from the shelf in the mop closet. He looked at the laminated schedule he had made 3 weeks ago, the one with every task color-coded and timed to the quarter hour. He had laminated it himself on his day off, at the print shop on Clemson Avenue. He had punched a hole in the corner and hung it on the little hook beside the light switch. He left it there. He walked down to HR with his thermos in one hand and his canvas bag in the other. The woman behind the desk was young, no older than 30, with a kind face and the look of someone who had been told to expect him and was not happy about the reason. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I have your paperwork." "I know," he said. She slid a clear plastic bag across the counter. Inside it was his wallet, which he had left in the break room 2 weeks ago and had eventually stopped looking for. He had assumed it was gone. Apparently, someone had turned it in and it had been sitting in the lost and found since February. He took the bag. He signed the form she put in front of him without reading it, because there was nothing in it that could help him, and he did not have the stomach to read another document that morning. "Is there anyone you would like us to contact?" she asked. "A family member or—" "No," he said, "thank you." She winced slightly when he said thank you. He noticed that. He was not sure what to do with it. The security guard at the front entrance walked him to the door. Not unkindly. The man's name was Pete, and he had worked the morning shift for about 4 years, and he and Walter had spoken briefly most mornings, the way 2 people do when they occupy the same building at the same early hour. Pete said nothing during the walk across the lobby. When they reached the glass doors, he held one open with his shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Walter," Pete said. "You too, Pete." The door closed. Walter stood on the sidewalk in the gray morning light for a moment. It was 6:14 a.m. He was not supposed to finish his shift until 2:00 p.m. He had nowhere to be for 8 hours. He took the bus home. It was mostly empty at that hour, just a few night shift workers heading back, a woman with grocery bags, a teenager with headphones and who was already asleep against the window. Walter sat near the back and looked out at the city moving past, the shops still shuttered, the streets still quiet. He thought about the east light. He had noticed it flickering again 2 days ago. He had written it on the maintenance list he kept in a small notebook in his chest pocket, the one he updated every morning. He had planned to put in a formal work order for the bulb replacement that week, because the flickering would get worse before someone authorized the repair, and it was better to get ahead of it than to wait for the request. He reached into his chest pocket. The notebook was still there, force of habit. He opened it to the last entry. East Corridor Light 3 flickering, likely ballast, put in work order by Thursday. He closed the notebook. The bulb would keep flickering. Someone else would notice eventually, or they would not. Either way, it was no longer his to fix. He got off at his stop on Garland Street and walked the 4 blocks to his house. It was a small house, red brick, with a narrow front porch where he kept a folding chair. His daughter, Carol, had offered 3 times to buy him a proper outdoor chair, something with cushions. He had told her 3 times that the folding chair was perfectly fine. He sat in the folding chair now and finished what was left of his coffee, which had gone cold somewhere around the second bus stop. Inside the house, the phone was ringing. He did not go in to answer it. He sat and drank his cold coffee and watched a sparrow land on the porch railing and then leave again immediately, as if it had arrived at the wrong address. He thought about 31 years. He thought about the way the building smelled at 5 in the morning, that particular mix of floor cleaner and recycled air, and the faint ghost of the previous day's work. He thought about the men's room sink that ran too hot, and the fire door that was slow to close, and the ceiling tiles with the water stains behind them. He thought about the gas leak in the old boiler room. That was 2004. He had come in early that morning because there was a large delivery scheduled, and he wanted to clear the receiving bay before the trucks arrived. He had smelled it before he was even through the East Corridor. That particular smell, sharp and wrong, the kind that sits at the back of your throat and tells you something is not right. He had not panicked. He had moved fast, but he had not panicked. He had gone through the East Wing floor by floor, knocking on doors, calling out, making sure every person in that section was moving toward the exits. 11 people had their desks in that wing. All 11 were out before he called the building supervisor. The emergency services team arrived 8 minutes later. Nobody had written a news story about it. There had been no announcement at the company meeting that month. There had been a brief note in the facility's report that referenced a gas main incident, resolved without injury, and that was the entirety of the record. Walter had received a handshake from the building supervisor, a man named Gerald who retired the following year, and that was that. He set his thermos down on the porch railing. He did not feel sorry for himself. That was an important thing to understand about Walter Briggs. He was not a man who spent energy feeling sorry for himself. He had been raised in a family that believed strongly in the value of work done without complaint, and that belief had settled into his bones over 7 decades and was not going anywhere. But he was tired, not from the morning, though the morning had been hard. He was tired in a deeper way, the kind of tired that settles in when you understand, finally and without any room for doubt, that a place you gave your life to never truly saw you at all. His daughter called twice more that morning. On the 3rd call, he went inside and answered. "Dad," Carol said, "I just saw it on the employee notification system. I still have access through my login." "What happened?" "It was a restructuring," he said. "Clause B7, she said. "That clause is for contractors. You have been there for 31 years. "I know." "That is not right, Dad. That is not legal." "Maybe," he said. "Not maybe. I am going to call someone. I know a woman who does employment law." "Carol." "Dad." "Let me have today," he said. "Let me just have today." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, that particular breathing that meant she was holding something back. "All right," she said finally, "but tomorrow we talk." "Tomorrow we talk," he agreed. He made himself a proper breakfast after that. Eggs, toast, a second cup of coffee that was actually hot this time. He sat at the kitchen table and ate slowly and listened to the radio, and when the news came on, he turned it off because he did not want news. He wanted quiet. By noon, the tiredness had turned into something else. Not anger exactly. Something quieter than anger and more durable. He opened his small notebook to the last page and read the entry about the East Corridor light one more time. Then he got his coat and walked down to the hardware store on Clemson Avenue and bought the replacement bulb himself. He put it on the kitchen counter when he got home. He did not know why he did that. He just did. It sat there for several days, that bulb in its small cardboard box, next to the salt shaker and the notepad where he wrote his grocery lists. A fact waiting for somewhere to go. The company he had spent 31 years keeping clean and safe had let him go without a handshake, without a signature on a letter, without so much as a note that had a real human name attached to it. The bulb sat on the counter. The light in the East Corridor kept flickering. And somewhere across the city, in an office on the 14th floor of the Callaway building, a woman Walter had never met was about to sit down at a desk and begin her first week of work. And nothing, not Walter, not the East Corridor, not the laminated schedule still hanging on its hook in the mop closet, was on her mind yet. But it would be. Nadia Osimensa had been running companies long enough to know that the first week in a new role was the only week during which she would see things clearly. After that, the building would begin to explain itself to her. The staff would learn how to manage her expectations. The layers of institutional habit would settle back into place, and the truth of how an organization actually worked would become harder to find. So she used the first week hard. She walked floors. She read files nobody had flagged for her. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable, not to be difficult, but because the uncomfortable questions were almost always the ones that mattered. Callaway Manufacturing had hired her because the previous 2 years had been difficult. Revenue had not collapsed, but it had softened in ways the board found alarming. There had been turnover in leadership, a failed expansion into a new product line that cost considerably more than projected, and a growing sense among investors that the company had become reactive instead of proactive. The board wanted steadiness. They thought Nadia Osimensa meant steadiness. She did not correct that assumption during the interview process. She was steady. She was also, when the situation required it, extremely direct, and she had learned over 2 decades of leadership that boards who called themselves progressive usually meant it right up until the moment you told them something they did not want to hear. Her first morning, she arrived at 6:30 a.m. and walked the building before the majority of staff arrived. She liked that hour. The building spoke differently when it was empty. You could hear which doors stuck, which floors needed attention, which spaces had been quietly abandoned, and which ones were alive with the residue of real work. She walked the East Corridor on the second day. The overhead light above the third panel flickered twice as she passed under it and then steadied. She noted it. She moved on. What stopped her was the mop closet. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open with 2 fingers. Inside, the shelves were immaculate. Every cleaning product had its place, labeled in neat handwritten marker. The mop heads were hung at uniform heights. The supply log on the shelf was current to within the last week. And on the inside of the door, hung on a small silver hook beside the light switch, was a laminated schedule. She took it down and read it. It covered the full East Corridor rotation, broken into 30-minute blocks from 4:45 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. Every task was listed. Every task had an estimated completion time. At the bottom of the schedule, in slightly smaller handwriting, was a single note. It said, "Check East light, replace bulb before it goes, don't wait for the request." She stood in the doorway of the mop closet for a moment. Then she went to find the facilities manager. His name was Gary Pullman, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had been with the company for 12 years and had the careful, slightly guarded manner of someone who had learned to wait and see what a new boss was actually like before committing to an opinion. "Who maintained this closet?" she asked. Gary looked at his tablet. He scrolled. He scrolled a little more, as if hoping the answer might change if he kept looking. "Walter Briggs," he said. "He was let go earlier this week, restructuring." "What day?" "Monday." She looked at him. "Today is Wednesday, Gary." "Yes." "The schedule on that door is dated 3 days ago. He made this schedule after he was told he was being let go." Gary said nothing. "Or he made it the morning he came in to collect his things," she said. "Either way, he laminated it and hung it on the hook." She looked at the schedule again. "Who authorized the termination?" "It came through Organizational Transition Services. New department, set up during the restructuring last quarter." "Who approved Clause B7 for a 31-year employee?" The pause that followed was not a comfortable one. "I don't know," Gary said. "That would have been above my level." She handed him the laminated schedule. "Keep this, don't throw it away." She turned to leave, then stopped, and put in a work order for that East Corridor light. She went back to her office and opened Walter Briggs's employee file. What she found there was not what she expected. She had expected a thin file. 31 years of uneventful employment often produced a thin file. People who showed up, did their work, and went home without incident did not generate a great deal of paperwork, and in HR systems, the absence of paperwork was sometimes mistaken for the absence of significance. Walter Briggs's file was not thin. It was, in fact, one of the most densely documented files she had encountered in years of executive leadership. The documentation, however, was not of the conventional kind. There were no commendations. There were no formal letters of recognition. There were no performance reviews above the standard annual checkbox format, which noted, year after year with minimal variation, that his attendance was excellent and his work was satisfactory. What there was instead was a long chain of incident reports, maintenance logs, internal memos, and investigation files, each one linked to Walter Briggs in the way that footnotes link to the main text of a story, quietly, at the bottom, in smaller print than the headline. She poured herself a coffee and began to read from the beginning. The first item that stopped her was from 1998. A facilities log note, barely half a page, recorded that a company employee, listed only as male, first-year accounting, had been found in considerable distress in the men's room on the second floor following a company-wide layoff announcement. The note recorded that the individual had been accompanied off the premises by the facility's staff member on duty, who remained with him until the individual confirmed he was stable and had transportation home. The facility's staff member on duty was Walter Briggs. There was no follow-up note, no check-in, no acknowledgement from HR or management, just the flat notation in a log that would not have been read by anyone who had not gone looking for it. She made a note of the name. The accounting employee had been identified elsewhere in the file through a cross-reference. He was now the CFO of a manufacturing firm in Ohio. She did not contact him. She just noted it and moved on. The next item was from 2004. She read it slowly. The gas leak in the old boiler room. The facility's report was 3 pages long and included a timeline of events, a summary of the emergency response, and a signed statement from the building supervisor, Gerald Marsh, who had since retired. According to the timeline, Walter Briggs had identified the gas odor at 4:52 a.m. and completed the evacuation of the East Wing by 5:04 a.m., 12 minutes. He had then called the building emergency line. The emergency services team arrived at 5:12 a.m. The gas main was shut off at 5:31 a.m. The report estimated that had the leak continued undetected until the standard staff arrival time of 8:00 a.m., and the East Wing's ventilation system ran on a timer that would have increased air circulation at 7:45, the outcome could have been considerably more serious. The report was careful about language. It said considerably more serious. It did not say what Nadia was thinking, which was 11 people. 11 people had their desks in that wing. 11 people went home that evening and ate dinner with their families and put their children to bed, and did not know that a man they had probably never spoken to had walked through their offices at 5 in the morning and made sure they were not there when everything went wrong. There had been no formal commendation. The board minutes for that quarter contained a single sentence under the facilities report section. Gas main incident in East Wing, resolved without injury, no operational disruption. Resolved without injury. Walter Briggs was not named. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Then she kept reading. 2009. A contractor billing fraud. The details were laid out in a finance investigation report that ran to 11 pages. A night cleaning subcontractor had been systematically billing the company for cleaning products that were never delivered. The quantities were small each month, just enough to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic audit flags, but across 18 months the total came to $340,000. The fraud had been uncovered when an internal review was triggered by an anonymous tip submitted through the company's maintenance reporting portal. The tip had come from Walter Briggs. He had filed it once. His supervisor at the time had not acted on it. He had filed it again 6 weeks later with a more detailed accounting. Still no action. He had filed it a third time and included dates, product codes, and delivery receipt discrepancies. He had compiled himself over 3 months of checking the supply logs. The third filing was routed to the accounting department and triggered the formal investigation. $340,000 recovered. There was no mention of Walter Briggs in the final report that went to the board. The report cited the anonymous tip but did not name the source. She checked the metadata on the digital file. The original tip, scanned and attached, had a handwritten name at the top that someone had partially obscured with a black marker when scanning it. She could still read it if she looked carefully. W. Briggs. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window and looked out at the city for a moment. She was not an emotional person, professionally. She had learned to keep a careful distance between what she felt and what she decided, because collapsing that distance made for poor decisions and worse leadership. But she was standing at the window because she needed a moment where she was not reading a file. She gave herself that moment, then she went back to the desk. 2017. The north stairwell railing. A renovation project had been completed in which the railing in the newly constructed north staircase had been installed 3 inches below the minimum height required by building safety code. The contractor had signed off on it. The site supervisor had signed off on it. The project manager had signed off on it. Walter Briggs had not signed off on it. He had written a note in the maintenance log, the log that the facilities department kept, the one that nobody in the project management chain had thought to check, noting that the railing was below code height and requesting that it be reviewed before the stairwell was opened for use. The note was dated 2 days before the scheduled opening. The project manager had called him directly after seeing the note flagged by a junior facilities coordinator. The conversation had not gone well. The project manager had told him, politely but firmly, that the installation had been approved by the relevant parties and that a maintenance worker's concern about the measurements was not sufficient grounds to delay the timeline. Walter had asked whether the project manager would like him to bring his measuring tape to the meeting. The project manager had said that would not be necessary. 3 days later, Walter had arrived at the project manager's office with his measuring tape, a printed copy of the relevant building code section, and a series of photographs he had taken himself showing the railing height against the code measurement. The project manager had called the contractor. The contractor had argued. The contractor had argued again. On the third call, with legal copied in, the contractor agreed to remeasure. The railing was 3 inches below code. It was replaced at the contractor's expense. The potential liability exposure in the event of an incident, a fall, an injury, a lawsuit, was estimated in a separate legal memo at somewhere between $400,000 and $1.2 million, depending on the severity. That memo was filed under Project Closeout documentation and had not been read by anyone at the board level. Walter Briggs was mentioned in it once, as the facility's employee who initially flagged the measurement discrepancy. She sat very still for a long time after she finished reading. Then she opened a new document and began to write. She was not yet sure what she was writing. It was not a memo, it was not a report. It was, in the way that things sometimes begin, simply an accounting, a list, a ledger of things that had happened and had not been seen. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When she put the pen down, she looked at what she had written, and she thought about a laminated schedule hanging on a hook in a mop closet, and a note at the bottom of it that said, "Check east light, replace bulb before it goes, don't wait for the request." She picked up the phone and called Gary Pullman in facilities. "Gary," she said, "the laminated schedule from the east corridor closet, is it still there?" "I kept it," he said, "like you said." "Good, can you bring it to my office?" There was a brief pause. "Sure," Gary said. "Right now." "When you have a moment," she said. She hung up and looked at the file on her desk. 31 years. A gas leak that did not become a tragedy. $340,000 returned to the company. A stairwell railing that did not injure anyone. A crying accountant who made it home safely on a bad afternoon. 11 people who went home to their families on a morning in 2004 without knowing why they were lucky. And on the other side of the ledger, $14.20 an hour. A form letter. A clause designed for contract workers. A clear plastic bag containing a wallet that had been sitting in a lost and found box since February. No signature, no name, no thank you. She pulled up the company's legal department directory and found the number for the general counsel, a man named Arthur Finch, who had been with the firm for 9 years and who she had not yet met in person. She dialed. He picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Finch," she said, "I have a question about Clause B7. Specifically, I want to understand whether its application to a 31-year full-time employee has ever been legally tested." The pause on the other end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted. "That is a very interesting question," Arthur Finch said slowly, in the tone of a man who was suddenly, quietly, very alert. "Yes," she said, "I thought it might be." Gary brought her the laminated schedule that afternoon. She thanked him, set it on the corner of her desk, and looked at it periodically over the next several hours while she worked through the rest of her first-week priorities. She was not sentimental about it. She was using it the way she sometimes used a photograph or a single document to keep a problem concrete, to stop it from becoming abstract at the moments when abstraction was easiest. Because abstraction was the danger. The moment Walter Briggs became a line item, a legal exposure, a corrective action, the moment the human being at the center of the story became a category, she would stop being able to think about it clearly. The schedule kept him specific. The handwriting, the quarter-hour blocks, the note about the east light. Arthur Finch confirmed what she had suspected by end of business that day. Clause B7 had been written in 2011 to address contract and temporary workers engaged on a project basis. It had been applied to Walter Briggs's termination either through error or through a deliberate effort to avoid severance liability, and given the circumstances, the distinction barely mattered. The application was legally questionable at best. A competent employment attorney could make a substantial argument on behalf of a 31-year employee terminated under a clause that was never written for him. "How did his name end up under that clause?" she asked. Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I can try to find out," he said. "It may take a few days." "Take the few days," she said. "But I want to know." She did not sleep well that first week. It was not entirely about Walter Briggs. The job itself was large and there were many things pressing for attention, but he was in the category of things her mind returned to in the early morning hours when the rest of the noise quieted down. The laminated schedule, the note, the east light. She had received confirmation from Gary that the work order for the bulb replacement had been filed and would be completed by the end of the week. That was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing, but she found she wanted it done. She wanted the light fixed the way Walter had intended it to be fixed, before it got worse, before someone filed a complaint. Don't wait for the request. By the end of her first week, she had 3 things on her desk that she had not had on Monday morning. The first was the laminated schedule. The second was a 12-page document she had put together herself, a detailed accounting of Walter Briggs's material contributions to the company over 3 decades, with financial figures attached where they could be calculated or estimated. The third was a summary memo from Arthur Finch, confirming that the Clause B7 application had been approved by a senior operations manager, who had since moved to another role within the company, and that the approval had been granted without the standard HR review that should have accompanied any termination of a long-term full-time employee. In other words, someone had taken a shortcut. Whether that shortcut was taken out of carelessness or out of a specific desire to avoid paying Walter Briggs what he was owed, she could not yet prove, but the effect was the same. She scheduled time with the board. She told them it was a quarterly review update. She had materials to present. She would not need more than an hour. She did not tell them what the materials included. The board met in the large conference room on the 14th floor, the one with the long glass table and the view of the river. There were 7 members. She had met each of them briefly during her onboarding. They were a mixed group, some who had been with the company for over a decade, some who were newer, all of them smart and most of them careful. The chair was a man named Edmund Hale, 67 years old, silver-haired, with the particular authority of someone who had been in the room so long that authority had simply settled onto him like sediment. He was courteous and not unkind, but he was used to boards that moved at the pace he set, and she had not yet given him reason to believe she would be different. She arrived 4 minutes early and set up her presentation herself. She did not need the 12 pages in front of her. She had been over them enough times that she knew the numbers from memory. But she printed them and placed a copy at each seat, face down, and said nothing about them when the board members arrived and sat down, and looked at the face-down papers and decided, in the particular way of experienced board members, to wait. She ran the first 42 minutes exactly as expected. Revenue figures, operational efficiency projections, an update on the Northeast expansion that the board had been excited about for 2 quarters. She was precise, and she was confident, and she gave them nothing to push back against because she did not want them defensive before she got to the part that mattered. She saw Edmund Hale begin to relax slightly around the 30-minute mark. That was what she was waiting for. "There is one more item," she said, and something in her tone made the room shift slightly. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment, the way people adjust when they realize the temperature in a room has changed. "Please turn your papers over," she said. They did. She gave them a moment to look at the cover page, which read simply, "Review of Employee Separation, W. Briggs, Employee number 471. Then she began. She did not editorialize. She had told herself before this meeting that she would not editorialize, because editorializing would give them a target to argue with, an emotion to dismiss, a perspective to debate. She would not give them that. She would give them only what was documented, what was verified, what had the company's own records behind it. In 2004, she said, a gas leak in the east wing of this building was identified and the area was evacuated before standard staff arrival. 11 employees worked in that wing. The evacuation was carried out by one facilities worker who then called the emergency line. The workers in that wing went home to their families that evening. The incident appears in that year's board report as a forward notation, resolved without injury. No further detail. The name of the facilities worker who performed the evacuation does not appear in the board report. His name was Walter Briggs. The room was quiet. She continued. She went through each item in the document. The contractor fraud, the $340,000, the 3 filed reports, the partially obscured name on the scanned document, the stairwell railing, the photographs, the below-code measurement, the contractor who had argued until he was shown proof he could not dispute, the 1998 incident, the first-year accountant, the loading dock. She presented each item the same way. The facts, the financial figures where they were applicable, the absence of any formal recognition. In total, she said, our accounting team has prepared a conservative, audited estimate of the direct financial benefit this company received from the interventions of Walter Briggs over 31 years. That figure is $3.1 million. This does not account for items that cannot be quantified, such as the well-being of the employees who were safely evacuated in 2004. It accounts only for what can be attached to a number. She paused. His hourly wage at the time of his termination was $14.20. He was terminated under Clause B7, which was written for temporary contract workers, and was never intended to apply to a full-time employee of 31 years standing. Our general counsel has confirmed that the application of that clause to this employee's termination did not go through standard HR review. We have significant legal exposure. And beyond the legal question. She looked at the room. She looked at each face. We have a debt. One board member began to speak. She held up one hand, very slightly, a small and deliberate gesture, and he stopped. I'm not here to assign blame for decisions made before I arrived, she said. I am here to resolve them. I have spoken with Arthur Finch. I have a framework. I want the board's support to proceed, and I want to proceed quickly, because this man is 71 years old and he has been waiting since Monday morning with a termination letter that had no signature on it. The silence that followed lasted long enough that it became its own kind of statement. Edmund Hale, the board chair, had not looked up from the document in front of him for the last several minutes. He was on the page with the contractor fraud. She noticed him turn back to the page before it, the one with the gas leak, and then forward again. He did not look up. 2 of the other board members exchanged a glance. It was not a hostile glance. It was the particular glance of 2 people who have both just understood something at the same moment. A third board member, the newest one, a woman named Patricia Voss who had joined the board 14 months ago, said quietly, "What is the framework?" And Nadia told them. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Walter was in the garden when his flip phone rang. He had been doing some light work along the south bed, where the hostas were beginning to push through, and he had soil on his gloves, and his back was complaining slightly in the way it had been complaining since his mid-60s. He pulled one glove off with his teeth and answered without looking at the number, because with a flip phone you answered and then you found out. "Mr. Briggs," said a woman's voice, "my name is Nadia Osai-Mensah. I am the new chief executive of Callaway Manufacturing. I am calling because I owe you a conversation, and I am hoping you will allow me to have it." Walter stood in the garden with one glove on and one glove off, and said nothing for a moment. I don't have anything of theirs that needs returning, he said finally. I know, she said. That is not why I am calling. He had not heard about the new CEO. He did not follow the company news after he left. He had made a deliberate decision in the first days after his termination not to spend time and energy looking backward at a place that had already stopped looking at him. But he knew the voice of someone who had done their reading before making a call, and this woman had done her reading. All right, he said, talk. She talked. She told him what she had found. Not all of it at once. She was organized and careful about it. She did not rush, but enough. The gas leak report, the contractor file, the stairwell railing, the accounting that her team had put together. She told him the number. He sat down on the low garden wall while she talked. He did not say anything. He listened, and the morning was quiet around him, and a small bird landed on the birdbath near the fence and looked at him sideways, the way birds do. When she finished, he said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you should know what you did," she said, "and because the company failed to tell you while it was happening, which means the least it can do is tell you now." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "A meeting," she said. "I would like to come to you if that is acceptable. I have some paperwork to bring." He looked at the bird on the bird bath. It had lost interest in him and was attending to a piece of bread crust someone, probably Carol, during her last visit, had set on the rim of the bath. "I have some conditions," he said. "Tell me," she said. "You come here, not the office, my kitchen." "Done," she said. "My daughter will be there." "Of course. And I want to know beforehand what paperwork you are bringing. I am not signing anything in my own kitchen that I have not read first." "I will send everything ahead," she said. "You will have it 3 days before we meet. You can have your daughter's employment lawyer read it." He blinked. He had mentioned Carol's connection to an employment lawyer only to Carol. "You did your reading," he said. "I tried to," she said. He agreed to the meeting. He gave her the address, though he suspected she already had it. He went back to his hostess. His back was still complaining, and the sun had come out fully now, and the soil smelled good and green and familiar. That evening, Carol came over. He told her about the call. She sat very still at the kitchen table while he talked, the same way she had sat very still as a small girl when he read to her, giving everything her full attention. When he finished, she said, "Dad, $3.1 million. That is what she said. And you did not know." "I knew what I did," he said. "I did not know what it added up to." Carol looked at him for a long moment. "Are you all right?" He thought about that. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about things. "I am not sure," he said, "but I think I will be." The paperwork arrived 2 days later, as promised. Carol sat with him, and they read it together at the kitchen table, the way they had read many things over the years. Carol's contact in employment law reviewed it and called back with several notes, 2 of which led to small amendments that Nadia's legal team accepted without argument. Walter read the amended documents himself, twice. The meeting was on a Thursday morning. Nadia arrived at 10 o'clock in a plain gray coat, accompanied by Arthur Finch from legal. She had not brought an entourage. She had not brought a photographer or a communications person or anyone who looked like they were there to make anything look better than it was. She shook Walter's hand at the door. She shook Carol's hand. She accepted a cup of tea. They sat at the kitchen table. The formal letter of apology was on company letterhead and had been signed by all 7 board members. She slid it across the table to him. He read it, all of it. The room was quiet while he read. Then she placed the second document on the table. It was a check. She did not state the amount out loud. The amount was in the document he had already read. She simply placed it in front of him and let it be what it was. He looked at it for a long time. Carol's hands were flat on the table in front of her. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were bright in the way that meant she was keeping something in. "This is not a pension," Nadia said. "I want to be clear about what it is. It is a settlement. It is the severance you should have received under the terms of your actual employment, plus a retroactive adjustment for compensation that should have reflected your contributions over 31 years and did not. We have called it value not compensated in the document, because that is the most accurate description we could find." Walter looked up at her. Whose idea was it to call it that? "Mine," she said. He nodded slowly. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Anything." "The east light in the corridor, has anyone changed it?" Arthur Finch blinked. Carol blinked. Nadia did not blink. "I put in the work order the day I found your schedule," she said. "It was replaced that Friday." He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back at the check. He picked it up. He folded it once carefully along the center. He set it next to his thermos, which was on the counter where it always was. Carol exhaled, a long, slow breath that she had clearly been holding for some time. They talked for another 40 minutes. Not about the documents or the money, that part was done. They talked about the building, about what Walter had observed over 3 decades, about the small systems and maintenance habits that kept a large structure running without drama. Nadia asked questions and listened to the answers with the attention of someone who was genuinely collecting information and not simply being polite. When she stood to leave, she shook his hand again at the door. "Thank you," she said, "for the conversation and for everything that came before it." He looked at her steadily. "You are the first person from that company to say that to me in 31 years. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I am sorry it took this long." She and Arthur Finch walked down the path to the car. Walter stood at the door and watched them go. The street was quiet. A neighbor was walking a dog on the far side. The morning smelled of cut grass, and somewhere, distantly, someone was making coffee, and the smell of it drifted over from the house next door. Carol appeared beside him. She did not say anything for a moment. She just stood there, shoulder to shoulder with him in the doorway. "You know," she said finally, "you never once complained, in 31 years. "I did my job," he said. "You did more than your job, Dad." He thought about the gas leak, the railing, the billing receipts he had checked 3 times, 4 times, making sure before he filed anything, making sure he was right. The 1998 accountant, sitting on the loading dock steps in the cold, talking about nothing in particular until the worst of it had passed. He thought about the laminated schedule on the hook in the mop closet. He had made it on his day off. He had wanted it to be useful to whoever came after him. He had not known when he made it that he was already gone. "I like the work," he said simply. Carol put her arm through his. 3 weeks later, Walter started volunteering at a vocational school 4 blocks from Garland Street. They ran a trades program for young people who needed skills and a direction, and they needed someone to teach building maintenance. The real kind, the practical kind. The kind that involved knowing how a building actually worked from the floor up. He brought his small notebook on the first day. He brought his measuring tape. He spent the first session explaining to a group of 15, 16-year-olds that the most important thing about maintenance work was attention, not speed, not equipment, attention, the ability to notice something before it became a problem. One of the students, a girl named Lucy, asked him how you learned to notice things. He thought about that. "You care about the building," he said. "You treat it like it matters, and then it starts to tell you things." She wrote that down in her notebook. He noticed she had her notebook out before he had even started talking, which told him something good about her. He went back the next week, and the week after that. He made a laminated reference sheet for the classroom. It listed basic maintenance checks, organized by location and frequency, with a note at the bottom. The note said, "Don't wait to be asked. If you see something that needs fixing, say so." He hung it on the hook beside the classroom door. The East Corridor light at Callaway Manufacturing stayed fixed. New hires sometimes asked Gary Pullman about the mop closet in the East Wing, the one that was still kept exactly as it had been, with the color-coded shelves and the laminated schedule still hanging on its hook. Gary always told them the same thing. "Read the schedule," he said. "The person who made it knew this building better than anyone." Most of them did read it. And most of them, reading the note at the bottom, the one about the East Light, the one about not waiting for the request, did not fully understand it on their first day. But the ones who stayed long enough eventually did. Edmund Hale, the board chair, retired 6 weeks after the meeting. He did not make a formal announcement. He sent a brief letter to the remaining board members thanking them for the years of collaboration, and that was that. At his last board dinner, he sat next to Patricia Voss, the newest member, who asked him what he thought the most important thing he had learned in his years of leadership was. He was quiet for a moment. "Pay attention to the people who keep things running," he said, "not the people who talk about keeping things running. The ones who actually do it." Patricia looked at him. "What made you think of that?" she asked. He picked up his glass and looked at it. "Something I should have thought of a long time ago," he said. And that was the last thing he said on the subject to anyone. Walter Briggs was in his garden the following spring when Lucy from the vocational program knocked on his door to return a measuring tape she had borrowed 3 weeks earlier. She had also, she said, identified a ventilation problem in the school's east stairwell that the building supervisor did not yet know about, and she had photographs and measurements and wanted to know if she was reading them correctly. He looked at her photographs. He looked at her measurements. "You are reading them correctly," he said. She smiled the smile of someone who had suspected they were right, but needed to hear it confirmed. "What do I do now?" she asked. "You file the report," he said. "You document everything, you include your photographs, and you file it. If nothing happens, you file it again. If nothing happens after that, you go up one level and you file it there. What if they still don't listen?" He handed her measuring tape back. "You bring your measuring tape," he said, "and you show them." She nodded. She put the measuring tape carefully in her bag. She said thank you and walked back down the path toward the street, and he watched her go with his hands in the pockets of his gardening trousers. And the morning was bright, and the hostess were doing well, and everything, more or less, was exactly as it should be. He went back inside, put the kettle on. His notebook was on the table where he had left it. He opened it to a new page and wrote the date at the top, the way he always did. Then he wrote one line beneath it. It said, "Lucy Goodeye, going to be fine." He closed the notebook. The kettle began to whistle. Outside, the day was warm, and the street was quiet, and somewhere in a mop closet in the East Corridor of a building across the city, a laminated schedule hung on a small hook beside a light switch, and the light above the corridor held steady. No flicker, no stutter, just clean, even light doing what it was supposed to do. The way it always should have been.